This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Kate is lecturer in French Studies at the University of London Institute in Paris. She's the author of Exile and Nomadism in French and Hispanic Women's Writing, published in 2014 by Legenda, and the co-editor of Exiles, Travelers and Vagabonds, Rethinking Mobility in Francophone Women's Writing, which is forthcoming at the University of Wales Press. Her research lies in the field of 20th and 21st century Francophone and Latin American literature, and more particularly in women's writing, comparative literature, transnational identities and cultures, writing of migration and exile, gender studies, and feminisms. Her current research project examines women's aging in contemporary women's writing in the works of a range of Francophone and Latin American authors. During the period of April to June 2016, Kate is based at the Institute of Modern Languages Research, where she holds a visiting research fellowship, during which time she's working on literary representations of women's aging in situations of migration, exile, or displacement, in works by Nancy Houston, Sylvia Baron-Supervielle, and Abla Fahoud. And today, her presentation is entitled Incorporeality and Gender Alterity in Les Aubes and in Memoriam.
Okay, thank you very much. Parler de l'offre de Lindeley devant Lindeley, quel défi et quel honneur aussi. Alors, my paper today examines the ways in which Lindeley's recent works disrupt traditional models of femininity through incorporeality and gender alterity to envisage revised gendered relations. Now, Leigh's novels, as we discussed this morning, are not often read as works of feminist writing, and certain features of her writing, such as the virtual absence of any female relationships, are sometimes cited as evidence of a suppression of the feminine or an absence of feminine solidarity. Put another way, if Leigh's novels were films, they wouldn't pass the Bechdel test. But I want to think about how we might read these texts as feminist works, and think about some of the questions that we raised this morning, considering that Leigh herself might not identify as a feminist or a feminist writer, by thinking about these ideas through her texts. And I want to explore this in the way that Leigh's female characters resist the constraints and roles that are imposed on them, and identify a more radical project of gender alterity in Leigh's writing since 2000. So I'm going to focus on two texts which portray female protagonists who are represented in highly ambiguous terms: Leigh's 2000 novel Les Aubes and her more recent In Memoriam. These novels both illustrate a resistance to hierarchized roles within sexual and family relationships, and posit alternative models of femininity, both through the physical and the psychological representations of their female protagonists, and offer alternative models of participation in domestic and sexual relationships. The nice thing about a day like today is I can assume some familiarity with the text that I'm going to talk about, but it might be useful just to remind ourselves that Les Aubes from 2000 is narrated in the first person by the now blind survivor of a failed suicide attempt, who attributes his suicidal drive to his unhappy childhood caught up in his parents' violent relationship. His only solace in life has been his love for three women, Vega, Forever, and Sola, who are all characterized as either readers or writers, and whom he describes as ses trois muses. In Memoriam also employs a first-person narrator who retrospectively recounts his past love affair with another character, also named Sola, who is also a writer, and whose name resonates in interesting ways with Leigh's early publication, Sola. In Memoriam's narrator is a despairing writer who finally meets Sola, a successful novelist, in a chance encounter in a bookshop after fruitlessly endeavouring to contact her through her publisher, and they begin a tormented relationship which lasts approximately 2 years until Sola's suicide. So in each of these texts we have a nameless, faceless narrator, male narrator, and a cast of female characters who are all either readers or writers, and whose symbolic names, Sola, Forever, and Vega, are granted to them by the male narrators or by other male characters. As Emily Roberts observes, this symbolic naming underlines the psychological dimension of the characterization over any other traits that might be grounded in history or genealogy. And the English and Latinate resonance of these names illustrates the intertextual and transcultural texture of Les' writing, as Alex Kerman identified this morning and in her recent book publication. The focus in these novels then, and in much of Les' writing, is very much on the psychological profile of the protagonists and on their backstories, which explain their current predicaments. Across Les' body of work, sexual relationships, and indeed most interpersonal relationships, are very rarely, if at all, portrayed as positive, harmonious accords, but are rather violent and characterized by their mutually destructive nature. This is all the more so in Les' portrayal of domestic heterosexual partnerships, where traditional power relationships between husbands and wives are often inverted, with wives and mothers carrying out the financially and socially dominant roles historically occupied by their male counterparts. In Les Orbes, for example, the figure of the mother and wife is the wealthy head of the International Business Consortium, who sees herself as having rescued her husband from his inferior class status and failed career as a painter, and employs him in a purely decorative role within the business in order to keep him occupied and out of trouble. Husbands and fathers are thus frequently portrayed as emasculated, often becoming subsumed by the relationship, if not eventually committing suicide, as is the case of the father and husband figure of In Memoriam. The offspring of such conflictual domestic arrangements model their own sexual relationships in opposition to the paradigms of their progenitors, as we see in both Les Orbes and In Memoriam, yet with very different stakes for the male and female characters. As Gillian observes in a forthcoming publication, Les' narratives are written almost exclusively from the point of view of the son or the daughter, and these texts at hand are no exception. In the case of In Memoriam, we see the daughter's response to the parents' relationship, and in Les Orbes, we see how the parents' violence has affected the son. Where the male narrator of Les Orbes seeks to break the mold set by his parents' violent and destructive relationship by seeking to immerse himself in what he perceives as a fulfilling, affirmative relationship with his sexual partner, Vega, whom he imagines as his other half, referring to her as son miroir and sa jumelle. The female character of In Memoriam, on the other hand, rejects the dysfunctional model of the parents' relationship by precisely the opposite strategy, by keeping herself at a distance from the male partner and in effect rejecting any kind of interdependency or domestic setup at all. In fact, it's those female characters who predominantly resist subsumption into the domestic heterosexual unit, in contrast with their male partners who frequently seek self-fulfillment and completion therein. Les' female characters, then, might be said to defy gender norms by refusing to participate in the kind of hierarchical sexual relationships that are modelled to them by their parents and offered to them by their partners, albeit in altered form. Instead, they seek alternative models of participation in sexual relationships, which also includes non-participation or disengagement from relationships imagined as complementary by the male partner and experienced as engulfing by the female. The insights of Judith Butler in queer theory might help us here to consider the ways in which Les' presentation of femininity undermines the gender norms that require the embodiment of certain ideas of femininity and masculinity that are almost always related to the idealization of the heterosexual bond. Les could be said to rethink her female characters' participation in heterosexual relationships, in which the female characters are imagined as the missing and complementary other half of the male other. While Les doesn't entirely efface the binary gender regime, she might certainly be said to offer a queered form of androgyny that blends the masculine and the feminine into a neutral gender position through the downplaying of the corporeal in her resistant female characters. It's worth noting at this point that Les' works contain very few textual references to bodies, either female or male, and the few descriptions of the physical traits of her female characters that do appear firmly emphasize their physical frailty. Les' alienated female characters are also attributed with marginal bodies. There is an attempt to efface all the traces of the corporeal, to emphasize their psychological rather than their physiological experiences. For example, Leigh emphasizes Sola's wounded psychological state in memoriam, and references to the body when they do appear serve primarily to reinforce her psychological description. In fact, the reader is hard-pressed to conjure up a mental image of In Memoriam's heroine, and Sola bears this physical absence in common with most of Leigh's female characters, who are frequently described as slight, frail, weightless, feu-follet, will-o'-the-wisps. Leigh's female characters are then, in some sense, largely interchangeable. They're all physically frail and show signs of suppressing their physicality through eating disorders, dressing in black, hiding behind long hair and fringes. Such a representation of incorporeal femininity reaches its most emphatic expression in the character of Forever in Les Aubes, whom the narrator describes as barely physically present, a light-footed silhouette, and une fée tombée de je ne sais quel ciel. Her vague physical presence reinforces her habitation on the absolute margin, itself a symbol of her psychological isolation. She lives by the sea, on a cliff in a cottage that faces the horizon. Her liminality and isolation could not be more pronounced. Forever's anorexia is another sign of her withdrawal from the physical world, which, for the narrator, projects her into a spiritual realm, as is clear when she says, Forever avait aussi ceci d'une fée, et se nourrissait très peu, d'une tranche de pain ou de biscuit sec. Cette abstinence était pour moi une preuve de son immatérialité, et non le symptôme de la maladie, l'anorexie, dont elle était affligée depuis ses 15 ans. Pour l'heure, la maigreur de Forever était à mes yeux comme le signe de sa sainteté. The physical self-harming in the form of anorexia in Les Aubes is countered by an intellectual drive through which Forever seeks to locate a sense of self, stating le refus de la nourriture s'accompagnait chez Forever d'une boulimie d'études. Like Forever in Les Aubes, Sola in Memoriam replaces food with words and physical sustenance with intellectual sustenance, such that sa chair, son sang, était fait de la matière même de ses livres. Of course, maternity is another significant way in which the material experience of femininity is suppressed and incorporeality is foregrounded in these two texts, as well as more widely in Leigh's writing. Although I don't have time to go into that here now, and people in this room have written on this topic with more insight than I could shed here. Instead, I'll go on to compare the physical presence of Forever with that of Sola in Memoriam, and then to discuss Sola's investment in the relationship with the male narrator. Like Forever, Sola in Memoriam is also described as eternally dressed in white, the colour of mourning in Les Native Vietnam, and deathly pale, thus presaging her suicide, which is already intimated, of course, by the novel's title. Her diaphanous presence and physical frailty are early on established in the novel when she is likened to une plante anémique, une enfant arriérée, et une vieillarde impotente, a plant, a child, a frail elderly woman, everything but an able-bodied individual. The frequent comparison between Sola and birds further emphasizes her fragility and, above all, her otherworldliness. Je ne cessais pas de le comparer à un oiseau de paradis, planant très haut dans le ciel et qui mourait s'il frôlait le sol. In addition to emphasizing her frailty and vulnerability, the likening of Sola to an oiseau perdu dans une boisque suggests the narrator's difficulty in being able to tie her down, and accounts for his failure to hold her within the confines of the kind of interdependent relationship he envisages with her. Sola continuously dodges and evades him, resisting the identity and the symbiotic relationship he attempts to impose on her. For the male narrator, their relationship is imagined as a constructive space for the affirmation of personal identity, his own. Yet the perception of this space as one of identification, is vigorously resisted by Sola, who seeks to define her identity on her own terms, and not solely within the limits of the relationship. We might at this point then consider an alternative reading of Sola's highly symbolic name as providing insight into the two lovers' very different investment in the relationship. We remember that Sola's name is one that is granted to her by the narrator and his brother, with whom Sola conducts parallel relationships, and which casts her in terms of her isolation. Nous l'appelions Sola parce qu'elle était solitaire et seule, d'une solitude souveraine. But Sola's symbolic name, despite being granted by the narrator and not of her own invention, can equally be considered a strategy on the part of De herself to define the female protagonist's identity in and of herself, a measure of her sovereignty, if you like, sa solitude suprême, insofar as her identity is self-contained rather than measured against the masculine other, be it the father or the male sexual partner. This desire for auto-determination is exemplified in Sola's adoption of a publishing pseudonym, which frees Sola from the imposed identity of the patronym, leaving the way open for redefinition of the identity in the present, and primarily as a writer. In a reflection on the nihilist tendency that she observes in a certain strand of contemporary French literature, Nancy Houston denounces the solipsistic masculinist drive behind such writing, which denies the physical, corporeal, and genealogical origins of human identity and experience. In this text, Professeur de Désespoir, that Michel referred to this morning, Houston makes a special case for Lindeley, stating, "De tous les néantistes vivants, Lindeley est celle que je préfère." For Houston, despite Lay's embrace of nihilism, self-sufficiency, and auto-determination, she states, Lay fait aussi une découverte importante. Les hommes néantistes ne sont pas ses frères, toujours enchantés de rencontrer de belles et fragiles jeunes femmes qui fuient leur mère. Ils sont friands de jeux cruels, dans son corps et son âme font les frais. Avec le passage du temps, elle comprend qu'elle s'identifie à eux, elle risque sa peau. Echoing Houston, Lay's character Sola does indeed come to realize that identifying with the male narrator and the identity he wishes to impose on her risks recasting her solitude souveraine into damaging isolation, a detachment that is appealing to the narrator as he seeks to become indispensable to Sola's functioning in the world, misreading her solitude as a sign of vulnerability and dependence on her part. He projects onto her an ideal of the missing and desired other half, describing her repeatedly as un miroir, un mon double, frequently referring to her as a long sought-after twin. Yet Sola is described as resisting this symbiotic desire and refuting any kind of resemblance they may bear to one another, effectively destroying the narrator's rêve de toujours, celui de salir un alter ego. The narrator eventually realizes that Sola sees the kind of alliance that he seeks as an undesirable subsumption of the self into the other, stating, Je mis du temps à admettre qu'elle se protégea de toute relation fusionnelle. Elle craignait d'être engloutie, et cette crainte l'amenait à se partager entre Thomas et moi, à délacer l'un pour l'autre, puis à fermer la porte tous deux afin de tenir conciliabule avec les personnages de son invention. Sola thus enacts a fragmented yet independent identity that rejects the narrator's desired fusion and attempts to warn him contre la tentation de se fixer comme unique but leur amour. In this way, Lay contests hierarchical, patriarchal, heterosexual relationships as a fruitful space for self-realization for women, depicting it as hindering women's autonomy and her inhabitation of a fully realized, multifaceted identity. So to very briefly conclude, I think we're led to consider then Lay's consistent use of male narrators. In a move that marries the worlds both within and beyond the text, Lay's characters encounter each other frequently as readers and writers, reading and writing to each other through the mediation of the narrative voice. And more often than not, that narrative voice is a male one, as is the case of the two texts that we've looked at here. Sola, Vega, Forever, and Sola are virtually inaccessible to the reader, presented entirely on the male narrator's terms, filtered entirely through the narrator's perspectives, and yet their struggles for self-expression and self-realization within the confines of the relationships in which they are involved are clearly discernible to the reader, leading the reader to pose questions as to the representation and voicing of femininity in literary history, in the French literary tradition, as well as in the evolution of this corpus. Thank you.